This is the third of a set of 3 Zoom meetings that we held this year based on our 2020 book, Global, Regional, and Local Dynamics in the Yemen Crisis. The book used a particular analytical model meant to convey the complexity of political interests inside and outside Yemen, leading to the country's collapse in warfare back in 2015. The purpose of the book was to gain insight into the underlying causes of what took place after the overthrow of the old regime in 2011, especially the crucial years of 2014 and 2015. This year, we organized a series of Zoom meetings in order to apply lessons from the book to the current situation in Yemen. We realized that there have been many Zoom meetings held in English to discuss Yemen over the past 2 years. It's not uncommon that participants and discussants agree with each other, each saying essentially the same thing. We seek open discussion from different perspectives and encourage polite disagreement based on reference to facts inside and outside Yemen. My co-editor, Noel Brehony, will make further introductory remarks, including information about our discussants and instructions about the Zoom call.
Hi, well, nice to meet everybody. I've got very little to say on this, because I think everybody's now used to Zoom meetings. I just want to thank the discussants, our distinguished discussants, for giving their time for this. We're very grateful to this. We hope you find it useful. Laurent Bonfoy has kindly agreed to moderate the first panel. So could I ask Laurent to start?
Yeah, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're based. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be back online with all of you, and I was asked to chair this first focus on 3 significant players, which are world powers and all have an important say when it comes to Yemen, the international focus, and these countries are Russia, which will be covered by Samuel, the UK by Noel, and the US by Stephen. I hope that the discussion will allow us to sort of focus also both on the constraints which exist on these countries, because especially since they are connected and have strong relationships with some of the parties at war, cannot act totally freely. And I think it's interesting to actually see what are the constraints that determine what the Yemen policy actually is, and then try to discuss also the different plans which are emerging among these, because they will obviously be very central if there ever is to be Yemen at peace.
His primary interest, from the beginning, was CT, counterterrorism, since the late 1980s. This is very much what we tried to bring out in the book, the building of the capacity of the security forces, first under Saleh and under Hadi during the transition, and later supporting the UAE, backed by direct action, often in coordination with the US. But there's also a consistent emphasis on the need to address the drivers of terrorism. I think that one of the distinguishing features about British policy, development assistance before 2010, then the whole process was kicked off by the Friends of Yemen process from 2010, where there was economic development was very much part of the counterterrorism support. And then very active support in the transition process. But I think UK ambassadors played a particularly conspicuous role in Aden, and of course and in the UN through holding the pen for the resolutions on Yemen. Once the war had started, the relationship with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and to some extent Oman became much more important. And as long as mentioned, it's the defence and commercial interests were very much part of UK policy. And I think it would be fair to say that the policy was determined as much by, shall we say, central government number 10 as it was by the Foreign Office in that regard. I think there was a tendency to see the situation as being as primarily a Saudi interest and should work through Saudi Arabia to try and handle the situation in Yemen. But I think there was an overestimation of Saudi's capacity to influence events. And I think a failure to understand how Saudi Arabia's capacity had been affected by the changes that came under King Abdullah to the special committee through which policy had been conducted on Yemen, and linked to the demise of Prince Sultan. So the Saudi ability to influence events in Yemen, although all the contacts remained in place, there was an absence of strategy to make it work on Saudi Arabia's behalf. So today, Saudi Arabia seems ready for peace, but not at the price the Houthis demand. The Houthis' hubristic approach over military success clearly know that there'll be a dominant force whether or not they take Marib. I don't think it will make much difference, but except in negotiations. So try to look ahead. We have to deal with the situation. Some of this, of course, leads into what's coming up later, but the weak leadership of President Hadi, combined with his remarkable stubbornness and ability to resist pressure from Saudi Arabia and the international community. The fragmentation in Yemen, which is becoming clearer and clearer. I spoke 2 days ago to a member of the Leadership Council of the Southern Transition Council in Yemen. And in talking to him, it was very difficult to work out who the enemy was, whether it was the Houthis, Islah, Hadi, or even the growing number of anti-SCT elements in Jordan. Saudi Arabia seems unable to get them to focus on the Houthi, on dealing with getting to focus on the Houthi-Iran threat and build up a coalition that can effectively bring the anti-Houthi forces together. And there was a ridiculous situation in Aden where two authorities are in fact competing to run things, and neither of them have the resources or the capacity to do so, leading to problems in Aden and beyond. I say Saudi Arabia seems unable to resolve this conundrum. It might be a capacity factor again. There's a limited number of people within Saudi's system that seem to really know about Yemen and able to influence events there. But that's the sort of general background. And looking at, I suppose the UK's fundamental aim from the beginning was counterterrorism. But has this been successful? Al-Qaeda and ISIS have been degraded, but not eliminated. And given the likely continuing chaos in level, may be able to rebuild in Yemen, where sectarianism has been growing.
Thank you very much, Noel. So we'll head to Washington, D.C. now with Stephen Day, focusing on the U.S., and then we'll go to Moscow with Samuel.
Okay, Washington via Florida, where I'm located right now. I'm going to give a bit of background about how these issues play out in American politics, and then lead up to what we're seeing in the new Biden administration and perhaps where things stand. Obviously, America's primary interest in Yemen is a lot like the British. Between 2011 and 2015, the emphasis was placed on counterterrorism policy, but also concerns about security of the Bab el-Mandeb. The US always viewed government control in Sana'a as a key requirement on both points. Earlier in the 2000s, the US government grew to distrust Saleh. After 2011, it threw its full support behind transitional President Hadi. The latter support of Hadi remained true under both Obama and Trump. As Hadi lost control in Sana'a in late 2014, early 2015, There was a difference of opinion between the embassy in Sana'a and Obama's national security advisors at the White House, with the latter asking the embassy to keep open channels of communication with Houthi leaders in order to preserve Yemen's transition, and the ambassador in Sana'a showing no interest in communicating with Houthi leaders due to complete distrust of their commanders. This indicated a familiar problem in US foreign policy, namely disunity of purpose and discontinuity in policy due to divided interests and powers in government. The problem continued under the Trump administration, due especially to the president's unusual style of decision-making and lack of trust in his first secretaries of state and defense, who had early departures from the administration. Rex Tillerson in early 2018 and Jim Mattis in early 2019. When the international war began in Yemen in March 2015, President Obama and his national security advisors appeared uninformed about Saudi Arabia's true intentions. They later claimed to be surprised that Saudi Arabia launched such extensive attacks on Yemen. Yet the US ambassador who departed Yemen in February said he anticipated Saudi bombing of Yemen a month earlier, from the moment he arrived at his new offices in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. In other words, there were strong differences of understanding between the two. They were clearly not on the same page. By the next year, 2016, President Obama began limiting US support of the Saudi Emirati coalition's war. Going back to the 1950s, it was long said that the US developed its stance toward Yemen with an eye on the interests of its Saudi allies. This remained true during the Obama years, but due to President Obama's growing policy differences with Saudi Arabia over Yemen, Syria, and other areas of concern, the US-Saudi relationship became increasingly strained. In 2015, 2016, it was perhaps more strained than any time since 1973 under the Nixon administration. All of this changed when Donald Trump became president in January 2017, as Trump prioritized friendship with Saudi and Emirati leaders and sought to reorient US policy toward Yemen in their favor. In part, Trump's singular intent to please the two Gulf allies, especially at a time of the Saudi Emirati blockade on Qatar, led to the dismissal of Tillerson and Mattis. Afterward, the White House increased its pressure on Iran, and one of its departing acts was to place Yemen's Ansar Allah group on the state list of terrorist organizations overseas. When Biden entered the White House earlier this year, he removed Ansar Allah from the terrorist list and spoke of a new diplomatic approach to ending the war in Yemen. Yet no progress has yet been made, and there remain countervailing interests in the US government that may prevent it from affecting any real change in the US stance toward Yemen or Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Samuel, who's, I don't think in Moscow, but we'll cover Russia and what happens from there. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, I'm covering Moscow from Oxford. So just to give a brief overview of Russian policy towards Yemen, obviously in the quarter century before the Houthi coup d'etat and the Saudi-led military intervention in Yemen in 2014 and 2015, Russia was really a marginal player in terms of engagement with Yemen. I mean, after they suspended financial support for the PDRY in 1990, Russia briefly tried to enter the table as a diplomatic negotiator during the 1994 Civil War, but that ended in quite a spectacular failure, and it pivoted back to the United Nations. Russia was a periodically important arms supplier to Yemen. They had about $2.5 billion in contracts that were signed between 1990 and Saleh's fall. But after Saleh's fall, Yemen made up only 1.6% of Russia's arms sales towards the Middle East and fell behind many other Arab client states. And even during Saleh's time in power, the Russians, for example, were trying to offload MiGs to various countries in the region, but the Yemenis wouldn't necessarily purchase them, and the Algerians wouldn't purchase them, so they ended up testing the limits of the UN arms embargo on Sudan and supplying it to Bashir instead. So even during the Saleh era, the Russia-Yemeni relationship was quite shaky, even if it was cordial on the outside, as both countries opposed the Iraq War and both countries were close, and there wasn't really much in the way of material interests or benefits. The primary driver of closer relations with Yemen at that time came from the upper house, the Federation Council. But the Federation Council was often banging a drum about the need to have a resurgence in the Red Sea that the Russian Foreign Ministry, Defense Ministry, and Vladimir Putin were not really listening to. Then in 2014 and 2015, the policy from Russia evolved quite rapidly as Russia wanted to ensure that its proxy war with Saudi Arabia was largely confined towards Syria and didn't want to escalate tensions with them too much. But by the same token, it wanted to ensure that their cooperation with Iran in Syria would not be jeopardized by disagreement in another theater like Yemen. And they were trying to build a closer relations with the UAE, leading up to the Strategic Partnership Agreement in 2018. So to balance the interests of all sides in Yemen, in the Gulf, Russia pursued a policy of strategic non-alignment in Yemen. And that was never a strategic non-alignment where it was like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, every side being treated equally. There were moments, certainly, like after the Houthi coup, when Lavrov unfavorably compared it to Euromaidan, or after Saleh's assassination, when the Russians were a lot cooler towards the Houthis. There were moments when the Russians were frustrated with the Saudi-led coalition, in particular in the immediate aftermath of the March 2015 military intervention, when Russia almost vetoed and then ultimately decided to abstain from UN Resolution 2216. And Russian defense officials like Patrushev and media outlets were warning that Saudi Arabia was launching an expansionist power grab in the region, or was even trying to turn Yemen into a terminal failed state like Somalia. So there were periods of disagreement there. The periods of disagreement with the UAE and Russia have been a little less pronounced. Perhaps the only condemnatory statement from Russia came in August of 2019, during the peak of the clashes in Aden, when the Russians warned the Emirates to stand back and not get too involved here. So Russia pursued this policy of strategic non-alignment, balancing between different sides, sometimes more cordial to one side, sometimes more cordial to another, but never really burning their bridges on all ends. And the assumption was that this was going to lead to some kind of diplomatic arbitration, or some kind of a broader projection of diplomatic power, because Russia was obviously the primary negotiator in Syria. It was trying to position itself as an arbiter in Libya. It was hosting the Moscow format peace talks in Afghanistan. The Yemen was seen as a potential theater where Russia could potentially leverage its connections to all sides and do good. And inside Russian academic circles and in policy debates, there were debates as to whether Russia could act as an assistant to a stagnant UN-led process, and maybe spearhead within the UN Security Council an upgrade or revision of UN Resolution 2216. And Russian ambassador to Yemen, Vladimir Dedushkin, was sympathetic to that idea. But ultimately, in spite of their growing diplomatic assertiveness in the Middle East, the fact that they stood aloof from Yemen and they did not engage in such a notable diplomatic way or engage as a dialogue facilitator is quite interesting. It was marked by caution, it was marked by restraint, it was marked by a lack of involvement. And I think that lack of involvement ultimately stemmed from the fact that it was very, very difficult for anybody to emerge as an unbiased mediator inside Yemen. Look at the heat, for example, that Martin Griffiths and UN officials have gotten for being seen as being partial to one side by various factions in the conflict. And that any intervention would simply be too high risk and too low reward. They would risk alienating any particular side and not really achieve very much diplomatically. And the memory of 1994, I think, also lived on. And that's why the Russians have been, I think, quite restrained in their approach, contrary to what some people might have expected from 2015 to 2017. So now looking ahead at just to conclude briefly at some of the very recent developments, these are a couple of trends that I think we should be watching in terms of Russian involvement in Yemen. One, Russia seems to have rectified its 3-decade-long struggle to find a base on the Red Sea, which failed in Djibouti, obviously stagnated and aided into the war, with the base that's been provisionally agreed to in Port Sudan. And that means that the strategic significance of Aden in the long term for Russia has dissipated somewhat. And that might also coincide with a movement away from support for Southern Yemeni independence or Southern Yemeni autonomy. So back in 2019, Dmitry Polyansky was saying that, did not make any statements about Yemeni unity, unlike other great powers during the Aden clashes. I spoke to the Russian ambassador to Saudi Arabia at the time, and he was telling me as well that the situation was that the Russians would be open to considering a federal solution. But over the past couple of years, from my interviews and engagement with the Russians, they seem to be a lot cooler on the issue of supporting South Yemeni separatism, even if they nominally maintain lines of communication. And that could be because they've looked towards Port Sudan as their Red Sea foothold, and Aden has diminished. So maybe it will be less of this kind of an equibalancing balancing strategy. It'll be more focused on Yemeni unity and balancing between the Saudi-led coalition and the Houthis going forward, while not antagonizing the Emirates. So maybe it's not going to be a perfect strategic non-alignment. Another thing, of course, would be Russia's involvement in terms of humanitarian aid, whether that could be the contributions in terms of supply of wheat and food security. They've signaled a lot about Saudi casualties, almost as a whataboutism about what they're doing in Syria. And maybe this could be a good way to burnish Russia's image as a humanitarian stakeholder, or further its weak diplomacy towards a more humanitarian sphere. That could be something else to watch. And finally, will the Russians, how will the Russians deal with Iran's and the Houthis' continued intransigence in this conflict? Because the Russians do not necessarily always agree with Iran, at least on the strategic end games. They certainly did not agree with Iran's appointment of an ambassador to Sana'a. They had very different views on Saleh's death. The Iranian media was quite celebratory about it. The Russian media, and Lavrov in particular, were very condemnatory of what the Houthis had done. So they're not going to necessarily align on all things, but the Russians have tried to say that Iran is a responsible stakeholder. They deserve a seat at the table. The Russian peace plan has been mirrored off of the 4-point plan that was leveled by Jawad Zarif at the start of the war. And the Russians are facing invitations from the Houthis, including the Mohammed al-Houthi, who asked Lavrov to mediate in Yemen. So some within the Houthis are a little more skeptical. I think al-Bukaiti actually criticized Russia as something of a neo-colonial power, much like the British and the Americans. So the Houthis are divided in how they view Russia. But this is the big question. Will Russia try to elevate Iran's political standing without necessarily agreeing with it? And if it does so in that kind of unwieldy way, will elevating Iran cause backlash against the Saudis, and will their dissent against Iran cause tensions with Tehran that could spill over to other theaters? That's an open question to answer.